Hi, and welcome to the lecture for chapter number 2, which is on human communication in small groups. This chapter is all about the communication processes that occur within a small group setting. In chapter 1, we learned a little bit more about what a small group is, what a small group does, and how small groups are really all around us. But now it's time to take it one step further. As you know by now, part of this class involves doing a significant small group project. And the way that that project is going to come to fruition is by you communicating within a group. Yes, communication is the power that's needed to accomplish tasks. And so when we have a class on small groups, we can't not talk about communication. In fact, you see in this course is titled Small Group Communication. So we're going to walk through those communication processes today. I'll try to keep it moving relatively quick, so let's jump right in. Whenever we talk about human communication in small groups, we've got to first recognize that context matters, and context is crucial for any communication outcome. Now, this is true for all communication, not just small group communication. So, we define context as the situation or environment that influences the dynamics of communication. This is obvious, right? The way you communicate at a funeral is different than the way you communicate at a wedding. The way you communicate with your mom is a lot different than the way you communicate with your boss. And indeed, the way you communicate with members of a small group is different than the way you would communicate one-on-one with a friend, colleague, or partner. Why? All of those are dependent on the context. In small group communication, a small group is itself the context. It's a unique entity, it's an environment, and it influences the dynamics of communication. So with that in mind, we've got to recognize that there are a few things that influence context. First and foremost, especially in terms of small group communication, it's the number of people involved. So the first thing we've got to consider is that in a small group, the amount of people who are part of that group is going to drastically influence not only the context but the final communication outcome. Because how you communicate between and among 3 people is a lot different than how you communicate between and among 7 people. And how you communicate between and among 7 people is a lot different than how you communicate between and among 21 people. Now, all of those technically fit the definition of a small group, but a group of 3 and a group of 21 are probably going to accomplish completely different tasks and have completely different styles of communicating. Second is the role of psychological complexity. So while feedback in face-to-face small groups is often immediate, just like it is in one-on-one interpersonal communication, it becomes much more psychologically complex. And again, this is due to the amount of people that are involved in that small group communication. So when we talk one-on-one, we don't have to make a lot of latitude for the people we're communicating with, but with a group of 7, there are 7 people who bring unique values, worldviews, beliefs, experiences, and also unique abilities. So the psychological complexity needs to be considered by communicators because you've got to make an account for every single person in that group. That can make communicating in small groups much more exhausting than communicating one-on-one, and maybe part of the reason why people don't like working in groups to begin with. Number 3 is the role of formality. So in one-on-one interpersonal conversations, we don't often think, well, who's the leader and who's the follower and what role does everybody play? But in small groups, we're almost forced to do that because small groups often reconvene or convene around a task. So in order to accomplish that task, as we'll learn in later chapters, we've got to have leaders. We've got to have people with designated roles. This causes there to be a little bit more of a formal feel to the communication in small groups and can influence the overall structure of that communication and ultimately the communication outcome. And then fourth is what we call the pressure cooker syndrome. So let's assume you have a group of 7 people. Those 7 people are all centered around one task, sure, but they likely all have 7 different ideas about how to accomplish that task. So there's this pressure to accomplish both their individual goals as well as their group goals. So this can be kind of a weird line that people have to tread. And all these work holistically together to situate small group communication as a communication context that's actually pretty complex. So we're hearing the word communication a lot. Let's define it. We define communication as a transactional process by which people simultaneously create, interpret, and negotiate shared meaning through their interaction. So we hear the word communication a lot. It's something we throw out a lot. We think we understand it, but there are a few key elements that you really need to latch onto in terms of this course. Number 1, we must see communication as a transaction. That's super important because it doesn't involve just one person. Even if it's a public speaking situation, it always involves more than one person. Second, it involves a process by which people create, interpret, and negotiate, here's a key word, shared meaning. So we want to arrive at shared meaning. That's the whole goal of communication. That way, when my wife says, "Hey babe, can you do the dishes?" I understand exactly what she said. Whereas if she said, be nice if somebody did the dishes, that says something a lot different, and as does, oh man, these dishes really need done. Each of those varies in their degree of transactionality and the approach to shared meaning. But the goal of communication is to arrive at that shared meaning. And it always occurs through interaction. And every communication situation involves interaction. Again, even if it's a public speaking situation, the speaker feeds on what the audience is saying back to them, even if it's not verbal. So let's look at some principles of communication. First and foremost, we must regard that human communication is symbolic. And we define symbols as arbitrary human creations used to represent something with which they have no inherent relationship. And really, all words are symbols. Even the word group is a symbol. Everything we say is a symbol. There has been no one human language that has been categoristically handed down throughout history that represents all objects with linguistic words that are accepted by everybody. No, words are creations. Communication is a creation. I mean, think about how we all have different ideas about something. When I say religion, what do you think? My religion looks a lot like this. I'm part of a very multicultural church community. I come from the Pentecostal church, which has always been very open and inclusive to people of different ethnicities and races, people in different genders being leadership roles. That's what it looks like to me. When I say social movement, what do you think of? I think of things like this, the Black Lives Matter movement, which is really getting all of our attention right now in this present moment and calling us to think more about racial inequity. Now, your experiences with religion may not look like this, and it may not have been the first thing you thought of. Your experiences with activism and social movements may not look like this. That's a key element, and it really relates to the next principle of communication. These are symbols, but our understanding of those symbols happens because communication is personal. I mean, when I say babe, what do you say? Or what do you think? I'm sorry. What do you think when I say babe? Well, this is what I think of. This is my beautiful wife. Her name's Jennifer. We've been together for many years now, but we've always called each other babe, which as a gender scholar, I'm like, well, it's kind of sexist and patriarchal, but whatever. It's just a term. So when you say babe, I think, oh, my babe, right? When I say Moses, do you think of this? When I say Kennedy, do you think of this? Because when I hear Moses and Kennedy, this is what I think of. Those are my two kids. Kennedy's 4, and Moses is almost 1 at this point. Those are Moses and Kennedy to me. So who am I to say that this is Moses and Kennedy? Or who are you to say that this isn't Moses and Kennedy? That's the whole point of all this, is nobody is to say what one word means or doesn't mean. And in small group communication, we have to make certain accommodations for other people within groups to recognize that their understanding of specific words all the way down to the word level may not be the same as ours. Another principle of communication involves a communication model, and that's the communication transaction model. So we recognize that communication is transactional. And that simply means all people in a communication situation mutually and simultaneously define both themselves and others during communication. So if you've got your textbook and you've read chapter 2, you know that on page 27 there's a graph that represents this model. I encourage you to make yourself very familiar with that model. I can assure you that it will come up again. But let's break this down and try to better understand some of these. Let's take a conversation between 2016 presidential candidates Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And let's assume they had a conversation. These are real words they said. Hillary said in 2015, a Trump presidency would embolden ISIS. This isn't reality television. This is actual reality. So let's look at some of the roles here. We know that in the communication transaction model, there's a sender, there's a receiver, there's a message, there's feedback, there's shared meaning, there is noise, there's a lot of different variables. So let's break this down already. In this case, Hillary Clinton would serve as the sender, the initial prompter of a message, the first person who speaks. And the message that she's sending is that a Trump presidency is dangerous, right? Now, Trump later countered, not in direct response to this, but just go with me here, for example. This is something he's actually said, or he retweeted, excuse me. If Hillary Clinton can't satisfy her husband, what makes her think she can satisfy America? Now, what Trump is doing here is he's acting as the receiver. He has received this message, and then he's sending one of his own, but we don't regard this one as a message. We see this as feedback, because this is in direct response to this, or at least let's assume so for sake of this model. So what's happening here? You've got a sender who's sending a message to a receiver, which is Donald Trump, who is then sending a message back, and we see that message as feedback. So Hillary's going to build on that. She's going to say something she actually said in 2016. Donald Trump's bigotry, his bluster, and his bullying have become his campaign. Now remember, we said in that transaction, people are simultaneously defining both themselves and others. So think about what these messages say to the people who are delivering them. Whether you like or hate any of these candidates or both of them, think about what their messages have led us to think about them and what these messages say about them. It's an interesting obstacle. In the communication transaction process, there's also another role, and that is the role of noise. In the context of a presidential race, noise might be the media. It's people that detract from the true communication value, who add a new element. Breaking it down on a more simple level, in a small group communication setting, it might simply be somebody who doesn't participate, somebody who's clicking their pen, somebody who walks in late to a meeting. Noise is anything that detracts from the original communication encounter. I want to talk about two more theoretical concepts really quickly. We briefly touched on these, but those are encoding and decoding. Those happen back here at the message level. So let's look at these original messages. Encoding is the thought that we put into a message, and decoding is what we as the audience pull away from a message that's been sent to us. So what Hillary's trying to say here is a Trump presidency is dangerous. I mean, that's the bottom line. And what Donald Trump is saying, what he's encoding here, is something sexually suggestive, but she's basically saying that he's basically saying she's not qualified to do the job. Now, how we decode these is dependent on where we sit in society. If you're a Republican, you're going to probably interpret this a little more jovially than if you're a Democrat. If you're a feminist, you're probably going to take a little bit more heat with this than what somebody who may not care about those things does. Where you sit in society influences how you encode and decode messages. I'm not going to hit on this too much more, but just know that you should be able to diagram the following things: sender, receiver, message, feedback, encoding, decoding, and noise. You must be able to diagram those. I can assure you that they will pop up again. Another principle of communication is that communication isn't always intentional. And here's where something mind-blowing comes in. Guess what? You can't not communicate. Every single thing you do sends a message. Silence sends a message. Inaction is action, so they say. Everything you do, every blink, every movement, every use of dialect, every gesture, everything facilitates an overall communication meaning in any communication encounter. This is why it's important to think very strategically about your message, because your message is not just your words. In fact, your message is any action, sound, or word used in interaction. And action is a very broad term here. We understand action to be something very, very big. It could be anything. That's why it's very important to think intentionally about your communication. And then we also must recognize that communication involves content and relational dimensions. So yes, it involves content, but it also involves relationship. In the context of a small group, the content is likely going to be focused on the task that you have all been convened to explore. But there are relationships within this small group. Even if you're just a student group and you only know each other this semester, you're going to develop a relationship with each other. And your overall success is not dependent just on how you treat the content or the task. It's also how you treat each other. That influences your overall group's success. So thus far, this has been about communicating, and we've talked about how we communicate, how we speak, basically. But communication also includes an element that's super important, and that is listening. And we've got to first understand the differences between listening and hearing. Listening is receiving and interpreting oral and other signals from other people or sources. Listening is a biophysical process. It's the act of sound waves entering our ear and registering within our cognitive landscape. But hearing is much more intentional. I'm sorry, I have those completely switched around, and I'm not going to re-record this. Hearing is the biophysical act. Listening is much more intentional. Apologies. Hearing is the act of sound waves registering within our ears. Listening is much more intentional. And so we're going to look at a few different types of listening perspectives. Number one, as you can note in your textbook, there is the people-oriented listener. This is a listener who is sensitive to others, they're non-judgmental, and they're concerned about how his or her behavior affects other people. Often these people can become distracted from the task at hand because they are so focused on being on the same page as other people. Now think about why this could be beneficial. Every group can use at least one people-oriented listener because, again, groups don't just circle around tasks. There's interpersonal elements in place as well. So it's important to take account for the people who are in the group, making sure everybody's heard, everybody feels valued, everybody feels included. However, there are weaknesses because, again, those people can sometimes forego the task at hand. On the complete opposite side of the spectrum are action-oriented listeners. These are listeners who focus on the task and remember the details and prefer organization. They want to keep on track, they want to get to the final outcome, they want to be done. However, these people can sometimes, to the opposite of the people before them, forget about the interpersonal nature of groups, and thus not everybody may be heard, not everybody may feel valued or included. So it's careful to strike a balance between these. Third, there's the content-oriented listener. This is a listener who enjoys analyzing information and dissecting or discussing other people's arguments. I'm one of these people. I am always the devil's advocate. Even if I agree with a position, I want to find the holes in it because I desire to make something better. I want the content or the final product to be perfect, and that involves poking holes in my mind. Sometimes this can be seen as overly critical, and people don't always like working with me or people like this because they know that I'm going to poke holes in their argument. However, people like these are valuable to have on small groups because they may be willing to say things that other people are not, thus arriving at a better outcome. Then there are time-oriented listeners. And these are listeners who are sensitive to time. They might be impatient or try to move the group prematurely to closure. In small groups, student groups, we see this a lot. These are people who say, hey, I only got an hour to meet, so we got to get in, get done, that's it, I'm not doing any more. Also, the nature of this class is that it ends. After a few weeks, it ends. So this whole small group project you're doing is bound by the context of time. So in essence, we all have to be time-oriented listeners a little bit. But in small groups, this is about really rushing the process. And rushing the process never leads to the best final product. So if you think, well, I know which types of these listeners I am, but how do I improve? Well, that's a great question. How do you improve your listening skills? Well, the textbook notes that it really happens through active listening. And active listening is listening with the intent of understanding a speaker the way the speaker wishes to be understood, and paraphrasing your understanding so the speaker can confirm or correct the paraphrase. So active listening means you are actively tuning in to what the speaker has to say. You're attempting to get on the same page as that speaker. Again, that's that shared meaning. The meaning that they're encoding, you're trying to decode it in a way that is consistent with what they've encoded. And it also means that you're communicative. You say, okay, so let me see if I understand this. You're saying this, 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 and this. Now, in small group encounters, you're not going to do that after every sentence that's said. But you do it for the overall argument or the overall big thing of that communication. If they're saying we need to change something, repeat back and say, so I think what you're saying is we're going to have to change how we do X, Y, and Z. That way they can confirm or deny that that's what they've actually meant. So a paraphrase is simply restating in your own words what you think you've heard from the words of somebody else. I hope all of that makes sense, and I hope that you'll each engage in active listening as you meet with your groups. So there are a few other key terms that I want to blitz through that are noted in the book. All of these are very simple communication phenomena. If you've taken public speaking, and I assume that most, if not all of you have, you've already explored these concepts. So we're not going to spend too much time, but you should be able to define them. Here we go, we're going to blitz through them. These are things that influence the communication process in small groups. Number one is social presence. That's the extent to which group members perceive that a particular communication medium is socially and emotionally similar to face-to-face interaction. You inevitably are going to do some of your small group work not face-to-face. So I encourage you to select a modality that facilitates effective communication. Could be a group text, could be a Facebook message, could be email, could be through apps, could be through Skype or FaceTime. It could be any of those things. But try to select a medium that allows you to have the most similar to face-to-face type of interaction that you possibly can. If you do meet face-to-face, know that proxemics is going to fall into place as well. Proxemics is actually about the study of how we use space and territory between and among people. So proxemics really looks oftentimes at different cultures. Are cultures more comfortable with people being close to each other, far apart from each other, and masculinity and femininity. And we know that men tend to sit with their legs spread further apart, women tend to sit with their legs crossed. And again, this is stereotypically. And this goes back to the conditioning of gender roles, where men take up more space in society and women are told to be neat and quiet and be just a little bit more out of the picture. There's a whole, again, line of study that supports these things. But as you get with your groups, think about proxemics. Think about what the uses of space say about you and your group. Then there's eye contact. As you work together throughout the semester, you're going to become very comfortable with each other, and you're probably going to engage in great eye contact. If you've taken public speaking, you know that this can actually be a significant part of your overall communication message. It conveys confidence. It conveys a certain level of commitment. Next is kinesics, which is how we communicate through movement. So even in your final presentations as a group, don't abandon these simple concepts. Then there's the concept of paralanguage, which are nonverbal characteristics of voice and utterance. That's pitch, rate, tone, speed, fluency, pauses, variations, etc. We've got back channels. Back channel refers to nonverbal vocalizations such as mm-hmm or mm-mm that are uttered while another is speaking. So these are often determined by culture, but this is a way to acknowledge what other people are saying, to show, yes, I'm tuned in with you in this communication encounter. Then there's dialect, which is a regional variation in the pronunciation, vocabulary, and or grammar of a language. And this can also influence that shared meaning as well. I mean, think about the word soda. I say soda when I'm referring to a Diet Coke. If you're from Texas, you're going to say, can I have a Coke? No matter what type it is. If it's Diet Coke, you're still asking for a Coke. If you're from the Midwest, oh my dear Lord, you're going to ask for a pop. That's not a real thing. I hate when people say that. But the same artifact can have different meaning based on our own regional upbringings, which also relates to dialect. Then there's haptics, which is the study of the perception and use of touch. All of these individual finite communication behaviors work together to create communication encounters that are perceived differently by different people. It's important to hit on these terms even though we've rapid blitzed through them because they're part of the overall communication process. Thus, they're definitely part of the small group communication process. The big takeaways from this chapter, however, are the theoretical models we've touched on. The communication transaction model, the different types of listening, the role of communication and symbols. Pay close attention to those and be ready to articulate and apply those when we meet in class. This is the end of Chapter 2. Thank you for tuning in. Please remember, as always, to submit your study guide and contact me with any questions. I'm always happy to help. Have a fantastic day, and again, thanks for watching.